Welcome back, everyone, for the second or afternoon session, I should say, of the symposium. I'm Professor Raymond Koo, and I would like to welcome all of you for our artificial intelligence and self-driving cars section of this material. So I'll start to introduce each of our speakers in turn. So let me head back to the podium. So our speaker on Zoom is Mr. Joel Robertson. He's partner at Holland and Knight. And before coming, and as part of his work, he's going to be able to kind of connect us not only to the self-driving and autonomous car issues, but other vehicles as well as part of maybe the historic, hopefully context for these kind of developments and regulations. So would you like to begin?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. Really excited to have this and have it be part of a conversation with you all about autonomous vehicles. By way of background, as Raymond mentioned, I'm a partner at Holland and Knight, which is a law firm, international law firm, but I'm based in Washington, D.C. Before I joined the firm, I worked on Capitol Hill for the House of Representatives. I clerked for a House committee during law school and then joined the firm after law school. And my practice focuses on representing clients primarily at the intersection between transportation and technology. So I represent clients in the autonomous vehicle space, electric vehicles, electric aircraft, advanced air mobility, drones. Really the key component across all my clients is autonomy across all modes of transportation. And as a highly regulated industry, autonomy creates a lot of challenges because, as we all know, regulations and legislation often do not keep up with the pace of technology. And with transportation being a highly regulated industry, you really need government authority to do many things that you want to do within the transportation sector. So introducing autonomy, whether it be in a vehicle, in a drone, in an aircraft, on a ship, in a port, often requires at least government notice, if not government permission, in order to do it. So clients will come to our firm and other firms, but to lawyers to help them make sure that what they're seeking to do when it comes to deployment of autonomous technology can be done within the parameters of the laws that exist, or seek authority to get an exemption or change the law or regulations in order for that to happen. One of the key things to keep in mind is that automation in transportation is not a new concept. The way that it's being deployed today is very new and novel. But when we think back through the way that we have humans have been transported, there has been automation in that process for hundreds of years. But it's just happening in a way today that is starting to remove a lot of the functions that humans have typically performed. But those actions, previously were performed by a horse or a buggy, and a vehicle then took over, having an engine that was performing some functions that were typically performed by a whip to the back of a horse, are now performed automatically through pushing a gas pedal with a human foot. The future starts to look at, that there is no human foot, but that gas pedal is being pushed. And in some cases, why do we need a gas pedal when a computer can simply tell the engine to start moving forward without that? But when we think about the manufacturing of vehicles, just from a starting point, when Henry Ford developed the assembly line for automobiles, that was historic and novel, by kind of sliding that vehicle chassis down the line and having workers attach particular parts as it was going down the line. Now the manufacturing line for a vehicle often does not have any humans involved. There are robots that are building those vehicles, and each time that automation is injected into the process, there's always questions. Is this the right decision? Is this safe to perform that action? with the building of the vehicle. Now the computer is starting to perform the functioning of the vehicle. And, you know, when the first automobiles were developed, the horse lobby was very upset, right? Because these vehicles were going to be death traps, were going to be very unsafe and create difficulties out there in the environment. Obviously, we know that automobiles have been accepted and adopted, but we're in the same position today, where the autonomous transportation technologies present challenges that will end up with a changing of the workforce. Some of that being the workforce of you driving, you know, yourself or your children in your car, to taxi drivers, to you know, truck drivers, you know, moving goods around the country. And that creates a lot of challenges for us to think through as a country from a public policy perspective. How do we define when that technology is safe enough to be deployed? And how do we start transitioning people that are in those roles that were traditionally performed by a human into other roles? So as we start to think about what the challenges are that exist today for autonomy, I'd like to just break those down a little bit, especially from the perch I'm at. My job, I spend probably 3/4 of my time advocating on behalf of clients before Congress and the executive branch. So helping come alongside of a client, identifying what are the barriers to the growth of their business that are those barriers caused by existing law and regulations, identifying what the solution would look like, and then a strategy for how to solve it. And then in an ideal situation, come alongside the federal government to perform as a partner to them. Oftentimes, federal legislators and regulators are in a position where they know that existing law and regulations are a barrier. They don't know how to fix it, and they don't know how to prioritize what needs fixing in order to allow that, you know, future to, you know, be pulled forward. So what they're looking at is they're looking at industry, the industry leaders, they're looking at scientists, they're looking at public health organizations, researchers, university professors, to provide input on what those blockers are and what is the way to relieve those blockers without unnecessarily decreasing the safety on the roads. But interestingly, you know, Secretary Buttigieg was speaking to CNBC, Secretary Buttigieg being, you know, President Joe Biden's Department of Transportation Secretary. And he spoke, I have this posted on my on my monitor, but he said, with autonomous transportation, we could have a radically safer country. He said, frankly, the track record of human drivers is murderous. Which is a pretty bold statement, but when you think about it, you know, 35,000, 35 to 45,000, depending on the year, humans die on the road because of the errors that other humans make, whether that be that they're drinking and driving under the influence of some other drug, or not paying attention, or simply just make a mistake, or flaws in the way that the transportation system is designed. But when we think about that in the reality, then we all should, as a country, try and pull that future forward with autonomous transportation. But there's lots of questions about what that looks like, and how aggressively we should push for it, and when we can prove that that autonomy is ready to be deployed. In the first Trump administration, they took actions each year during which the president was in office to they published guidance documents, and through those guidance documents they tried to convey that there was an increasing and robust understanding of how autonomy was coming and an identification of where the barriers were. You know, this was back in, you know, 2017 through 2020, and so the autonomy was really still in a fairly a growing posture, so that the technology was not in its final state. But they tried to identify that, hey, we know these are problems, we know that technology can solve for these other problems, but each year they tried to incrementally say our understanding of the issue is getting more robust. But they took the posture in the first Trump administration and saying, what we don't want to do is start regulating before we know what the ultimate solutions will look like, because we could regulate out some technology that could change the world in the future, because we write the regulations for what we think the future is going to look like today. Now that makes some sense, right? If you write a regulation that says, okay, the autonomous technology has to perform in this way, because this is how we think it's going to perform. But then some future technology could solve the problem better, meaning be a safer driver, but the regulations don't accommodate it. Like, that makes some sense. But the flip side of that argument is it is a reason to do nothing, because we know that technology is always going to change, and we have to figure out how to get to a point where we have technology agnostic standards that say, here is the level of safety that we expect a driver to perform, whether that driver is a human using a human brain and human eyes and arms and legs, or if that driver is a computer or a computing system, we're using cameras and sensors in order to perform those driving functions, and start to go about the process of updating regulations to accommodate that. There was a study that was performed by a Department of Transportation research organization called the Volpe Institute. Volpe did a study of the existing federal motor vehicle safety standards. And since everything in Washington, D.C. needs an acronym, those are the FMVSS, if you are not familiar with them. But they did a study of the FMVSS, and memory serves, I think they found that there were 32 references to the human in the existing regulations. So when we talk about the blockers and barriers to innovation, those regulations which automakers use to self-certify that their vehicle is safe to be sold into interstate commerce. And let me pause on that for just a second. With vehicles, because we have, tens of millions of vehicles of cars and trucks on the road, automakers are not required to get each vehicle certified before it goes out into the marketplace. That would be impossible, right? We don't have enough inspectors to go to every assembly line and inspect every vehicle coming off the line. However, we do that for airplanes. Every airplane gets an airplane type certificate, meaning the aircraft design is approved. They get a manufacturing certificate to say that that manufacturer is certified to produce copies of that design. And then every final aircraft gets approved before it goes out into the marketplace. But we have hundreds of thousands of aircraft. We have millions of vehicles. So what the government did, and this is, a decision made, 50, 60 years ago, is say, like, we're never going to be able to inspect every vehicle. So we're going to create these standards, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. We're going to require that the automaker certifies that every vehicle that comes off the line is compliant with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. And then we'll update those FMVSS as technology continues to evolve. And generally, it's worked. There are examples of recalls that have identified significant flaws. You may recall litigation regarding the Takata airbags a few years ago about some automatic braking issues, where the recall authority has had to come in, but only after people died as a result of failures to ensure compliance with the FMVSS. But it's also true that those FMVSS do continue to evolve over time. Those standards now, require new vehicles to have automatic braking. They require, backup cameras in new vehicles. And so those are helpful technological updates that over time, as that technology becomes more ubiquitous, they then add it into the standard. But going back to that Volpe study with those 32 some odd references to the human, it says that in the United States, if you are manufacturing a vehicle, you need to manufacture it with the driver sitting on the front left seat. You need a steering wheel driven by the human hand. You need mirrors configured to the human eye for seeing behind you and on the sides. You need the gas pedal on the right so the human foot can depress that gas pedal. And so all of those references become impossible for an autonomous vehicle manufacturer to comply with without getting an exception or an exemption from those requirements. So those become some of the blockers to having a purpose-built vehicle that's designed from the outset to deploy in what would be referred to as level 4 or level 5 automation, as defined by SAE. So level 1 going from fully human to level 5 being a vehicle that does not have the possibility of a human intervention, designed to drive anywhere in the world, fully autonomous all the time. Level 4 is the technology that you would see with a vehicle like Waymo, where it is designed where there is still human controls, but the vehicle is designed to perform within its operating design domain, within its jurisdiction or geographic location, and perform all of the functions that the human would typically perform. But you'll notice that when you see, and maybe I'll just pause and see, because since I can see the audience, have any of you all ever ridden in an autonomous vehicle, or even in a level 3, level 2, level 3 vehicle like a Tesla that has, their full self-driving package? Okay, a couple of folks have that. Okay, so that's considered advanced driving assist. But then there is full self-driving, which would be more the Waymo or Zoox, or before General Motors had their vehicle, the Cruise vehicle that you could ride in. So in that experience, you may have noticed, certainly with Tesla's an add-on to a human-driven vehicle for sure, right? You as a human can drive that vehicle, standard in a standard basis, or your friend can, and then you can turn on full self-driving under certain conditions, since that's an advanced driver assist technology as opposed to full self-driving. Even in the Waymo vehicle, which is full self-driving, the steering wheel still turns, the gas pedal still gets depressed, even though there's nobody pushing it, but it still performs all the same functions. And that is because that's what the FMVSS requires. So the FMVSS is attached at the point of sale. So when a vehicle manufacturer or company like Waymo were to purchase a vehicle like that, they buy it from a manufacturer that makes that certification that vehicle is FMVSS compliant. They are then making post-purchase modifications to that vehicle to add the full self-driving package. And the legal theory under which this happens is much like you would purchase a pickup truck and then potentially lift it up and add bigger tires. Lifting it up and adding bigger tires is not compliant with the FMVSS, but it is something that you can do as a personal car owner, if you choose. And the vehicle manufacturer does not have to go back and say, well, hey, we need to evaluate that, or you can't do it because it's not safe, because that's a post-purchase, post-market modification, where the FMVSS does not reattach to that. Now, if autonomous vehicle manufacturer decided to then start to sell those vehicles that have had those purchase modifications, then they'd have to reconsider whether the FMVSS would apply, because then you'd be becoming a manufacturer that was selling into interstate commerce. But if you're making those modifications and then you're operating them yourselves, like in a ride-hailing service, the federal government really is not involved in that scenario, unless the vehicle gets into an accident or something that requires them to come in and perform an investigation on the back end. But where we are as a country now, 4 years later from the Trump administration publishing these guidance documents, all 4 years that they were in office, the Biden administration, Secretary Buttigieg said some nice things about autonomous vehicles. They really never made it a priority to advance autonomous vehicles during their 4 years that they were in office. They didn't do anything to inhibit it either. They really were just agnostic. Like, if the technology continues to mature, that's great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. And they really were pushed to take that position because organized labor created a lot of concerns about the adoption of this technology and the likelihood that it could put, organized labor drivers out of work, and also the trial lawyers. Trial lawyers have also gotten involved in the conversation, and they've blocked legislation before Congress on a couple of different occasions. And when you think about it, there is a significant industry within the trial bar that is based off of mistakes made by drivers out there on the roads that lead to incidents happening that may have injuries to property or people. And so the trial bar's got lots of questions about how will the advent of this technology impact the practice of law. There's also lots of questions about how the development or the use of these vehicles in a ride-hailing model is going to impact the ability to prosecute litigation. Because if you ride in a Waymo, or sorry, in a Lyft or an Uber today, you may have noticed when you sign up for the app, you're checking a box that all of us check that says that you're agreeing to arbitrate any claims that you have vis-a-vis Uber or Lyft. So if you ended up getting hurt in an Uber or Lyft, those ride-hailing apps would take the position that you then have to go to arbitration rather than litigation with them. And there's concern from the trial bar to say, if we moved from a model where it's personal car ownership, that people are driving their own vehicle and making mistakes that lead to litigation, to a model where it's autonomous vehicles that are all being offered for service in a ride-hailing app, through which every individual rider has waived their right to litigation and is instead arbitrating claims, is that a good outcome, for the to ensure that an injured party can get restitution for damages that they may incur? And so there's lots of questions that they have about, how should we continue to allow this technology to move forward rapidly, or do we need to slow it down to figure out the legal principles around that as we're going? But where we are today, obviously Elon Musk has an outsized influence over the current president, and is very involved in driver assist and ultimately fully self-driving vehicles. And the expectation is that the Trump administration will take a very proactive stance to continue the adoption of regulations and supportive legislation that would allow self-driving technology to move forward rapidly. So to update those federal motor vehicle safety standards to be more, technology agnostic, and to allow, the testing and deployment of vehicles in the United States to happen more readily. So we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but one of the keys is that lawyers are going to be essential to figuring out that equation, both inside the federal government, in helping write those regulations, take positions on legislation that's pending, and outside the government to help assist companies that are looking to deploy that technology, or potentially, litigating and helping address claims where mistakes are made in the process of developing the technology as it goes into the marketplace. And all of these issues, as I know other panelists will talk about, create very novel issues when it comes to those vehicles ultimately having accidents, which we've seen with Uber, having gotten in a crash and unfortunately ended up with the death of someone in Arizona, and General Motors ending up getting in an accident, pinning a pedestrian underneath one of their vehicles in San Francisco. Those accidents will happen. The theory is that they will happen a lot less with self-driving cars that have safety features built into them, but they'll still happen, and those will present novel issues that lawyers will have to help courts adjudicate, investigate, and ultimately resolve to help this technology move forward. But with that, I'll pause there, hand it back over, and happy to reserve some time for questions at the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a discussion of the history and background of these issues that I think everyone should have appreciated. I think you gave us a wonderful, both broad as well as deep discussion in that period of time. So thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions right now? Yes.
I have a question for Joel. My question is, with
You might need the microphone.
oh, sorry, thank you. Hi, my name's Sophia. I have a question. regarding Trump's appointment of Elon Musk and Doge. Is there any legitimate fear that these autonomous vehicles, this is not on. Okay, it's good. These autonomous vehicles could be implemented without the proper regulation as they're trying to increase AVs rapidly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of different angles that question could go in. I do think that the Trump administration is likely to take an approach that is going to be more flexible when it comes to the ability to deploy vehicles. Whether it comes to being unregulated, I think that's probably less likely, but creating some additional leash, if you will, or flexibility in the way vehicles are tested and deployed, they will likely be looking for those type of opportunities. And the Biden administration did as well. Right at the end, they published a proposed rule that would have created some new conditions for testing. It was a regulation called AV STEP, which was published in, I think, December of 2024 after the election, but before inauguration. And it was just a proposed rule. But I think across administrations, they are looking at, hey, how can we keep up with other countries and allow for this technology to be tested in a more flexible manner around the country. However, the other way that question is implicated, which I think is a good question, is Doge. There is now a executive order that requires each executive branch agency to approach the regulation of within their jurisdiction under a 10-for-1 approach. So you have to remove 10 regulations or guidances before you can publish one new regulation or guidance. And that creates a big challenge when it comes to highly regulated industries like transportation, because in this case, you could argue that a new regulation that allows autonomous transportation is really deregulatory in nature. Right? You're removing some of those regulations that only could be satisfied with a human driver, and you're replacing them with something that's more flexible or, again, technology agnostic. But there could be a scenario where the Trump administration seeks to do that, but is blocked by their own requirements that to remove 10 regulations before they publish one new regulation. And so that is something that I think a lot of folks are concerned about, because in the first Trump administration, it was a 2-for-1. And now it's a 10-for-1. And that could end up with a scenario that they may have to, put an inhibitor on themselves in how they publish new regulations.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna pass.
Is this okay? Hi, my name is Jane. I have a question as to the time frame or the likelihood that you think the government would allow for AV to be used in public transportation, and if you have any thoughts on that, like buses and things.
Yeah, great question. So it's actually happening today in a very small scale, or in various pockets around the country. There are autonomous shuttles that are being manufactured and used for small pilots of public transportation. So these generally would be like bi-directional shuttles. So they would go, when you think about like your Main Street corridor that may be serviced by a 30-passenger bus. There are some cities, there's a number in Florida, I think a couple in California, I think Atlanta, Georgia's got a demonstration project going, a couple others around the country, which would be a low-speed shuttle that would come and stop at stops along your Main Street, and come back and forth. Generally, they're fixed route and low speed vehicles. But when it comes to more broad application, there are a number of additional hurdles that apply to the use of autonomous technology when it comes to public transportation, because generally the federal government reserves the rights to the states to determine whether a driver is certified to drive within their state. That is a police power reserved to the states. So you get your driver's license from your state rather than from the federal government. However, when it comes to commercial motor vehicle operators, buses, trucks, heavy duty trucks, then the federal government's regulations do apply. Because those are considered to be vehicles operating in interstate commerce. So then you've got hours of service requirements and other regulations that accrue that you have to have special federal certification. So there are blockers once those vehicles get to a larger size and the vehicle is heavier, then other federal regulations come into play, which is going to mean that the deployment into those environments is going to take a lot longer. Those legal and regulatory challenges will be much harder to solve. And because they're common carriers, there's a reason that the federal government, regulates, large wide-bodied aircraft more heavily than a, general aviation aircraft that has 2 seats in it, and likewise why they regulate the operation of a large bus differently than a personally owned car.
Thank you.
All right, I think it's a good time. Thank you again for answering those questions. And I think it's time to move on to our next guest, Professor Tracy Fresco-Pearl from the University of Oklahoma will give us a much more kind of law professor, legal philosophy, or a scholarly approach.
You're about to say boring.
No, I love it. Scholarly approach to the problem of AI and self-driving automobiles.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Eric Chafee and to the staff and board members of JOLTI for inviting me here. This has been great. I've enjoyed everybody's talk so much. And I want to begin by acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is this is the most bonkers title that I have ever come up with for an academic paper. I was worried that my dean was going to fire me after she saw the name of this article. So I want to take a minute to explain how I got to this place in my scholarship and where my scholarship is going from here. So for the first 3/4 of my career, I was what I would call a very traditional law and technology scholar. So I wrote a lot of articles, and in those articles, I would identify issues with emerging technologies, and I would either argue that the government needs to regulate in a way that would fix those issues, or that existing regulations are problematic in some way and need to be revised. And that was all well and good, and I was particularly focused on autonomous vehicles, which I think represent a very interesting canary in the coal mine with respect to whether the federal government in particular has the capacity to effectively regulate and provide oversight of emerging technologies. So that was all well and good for a many number of years. In the last 3 years, though, I have joined what seems to be a rapidly growing percentage of the law and technology group of scholars who have begun to reluctantly conclude that the federal government can't regulate emerging technologies or provide meaningful oversight in the way that we think is necessary. That our legacy regulatory institutions, for institutional reasons, don't have the capacity to keep up with the pace of technological advancement, and are unlikely in the future to get any better at it, given that the problems seem to be getting worse rather than better. And that's partially because of the pace at which technology is accelerating. Gary Marchant at Arizona State has written a lot about this problem of technology, just advancing faster and faster and faster over time. Despite that being the case, things like OSHA regulations, right? OSHA is a workplace safety law, still today take an average of 10 years from implementation or from inception to implementation. We don't have 10 years to wait anymore on technologies like AI or autonomous vehicles. In many cases, we don't even have 10 months left to regulate. And so there's this pacing problem, number one. Secondly, and Joel talked about this a little bit, there's a growing knowledge gap between our legacy regulatory bodies and industry, right? That there is a sense that our regulatory bodies don't understand as quickly as they need to the issues being presented by all of these new technologies. And I don't say this happily. Like, I'm not somebody that likes to watch the federal government burn. Like, that doesn't sound a good Friday night for me. And so I'm not somebody who thinks that we should be stripping the federal government down to the bone. Like, I'm very worried about these issues. And when I started writing about these issues, the big problem was the trolley problem with autonomous vehicles. Like, does it kill the one person or the 3 people? Now we're talking about autonomous weapon systems and whether killer robots are going to kill us all 12 years from now. And this is going to be a really dark talk. So all this is a long way of saying is that when that's the reality, when you reach the conclusion that the U.S. federal government, at least, is not in any shape to meaningfully provide oversight of emerging technologies, the question is what's left? What's left? It has to be something, right? There has to be governance of these new technologies. And so what we've all begun doing in this space is looking elsewhere and trying to find what other models of governance exist. And in this paper, I look at self-regulation, industry self-regulation in particular, and set out to explore this question as to whether or not there are examples in our world of industries self-regulating in a way that should give us confidence that it could work with autonomous vehicles too. So more specifically in this paper, I set out to answer this question, right? Could this work with AVs? And that, of course, begs the question, what does work mean? What would meaningful oversight look like in this space, assuming that it's no longer coming from the federal government or NHTSA or any of the other bodies that Joel talked about in his space? And so here are my parameters for research. In my mind, for a self-regulation scheme to work, it would have to do two things. It would have to promote product safety of autonomous vehicles, safety remaining the major concern of most Americans, right? When you look at polling on autonomous vehicles, most Americans still report significant levels of skepticism about whether AVs will ever be as safe as human drivers, even though we can feel pretty confident on the scholarly side of the equation, the answer is absolutely yes, because human drivers are responsible for 94% of all crashes. The second thing that would have to be true is that this regulation scheme would also have to bolster consumer confidence in Americans, again, because of reported skepticism about this technology. So with these objectives in mind, I went searching for examples of self-regulation, and I found two case studies that I absolutely did not expect to be relevant in the case of driverless cars, but actually convinced me otherwise. And so today I'm going to take you through two very interesting case studies, one from the amusement park industry and one from the Hollywood film industry, that I think pose interesting questions about whether similar approaches could work here. So let me talk to you through my unorthodox case studies here, starting with US amusement parks. And if you don't know how rides are regulated in the United States, you are in for a treat because it is really wackadoo. All right, so in the United States, we have this very odd way of dealing with amusement park rides. So if a ride is movable, meaning that it travels with a state fair or a carnival or what we would call a non-permanent entertainment venue, it is regulated by the federal government through the Consumer Product Safety Commission. If, however, the ride is a fixed site ride, meaning that it's located in an amusement park, it is only subject to state regulation. The feds aren't involved at all. And states, as you would expect, vary widely in terms of the levels of regulation that they provide. So for example, here in Ohio, rides are actually very tightly regulated by the state. Other states like Alabama, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming impose absolutely no restrictions at all on amusement park rides. The interesting one is Florida. Florida likes to pretend that it regulates amusement park rides, but its laws only apply to parks with fewer than 1,000 employees. And so that means when you go to any of the big Florida parks like Disney or Universal, you are riding rides that are completely unregulated. They're unregulated by the federal government and they're unregulated by the state government. So that is the 10,000-foot view of rides, and you are probably at this point terrified to ever go on Space Mountain again. But let me hasten to add here that all of these mostly unregulated amusement park rides in the United States are actually remarkably safe, and that's great news. And the reason they're almost incredibly, overwhelmingly safe is because of industry self-regulation. So let's talk about the even crazier history of amusement park safety in this world, the United States, and I'm going to say this, pun intended, buckle up. All right, so in the 1970s and 80s, there were a series of very high-profile ride injuries and deaths all throughout the United States because the rides themselves were wildly unsafe. And the most famous of these parks, and you may have read about this on the internet, it gets a lot of attention, was Action Park in Vernon, New Jersey. Literally all of its rides were death traps, and if you don't believe me, I commend you to an excellent documentary called Class Action Park. Download it before you get on the plane. You will not regret it.
I
Okay?
have testified to that personally.
It's fabulous, right?
No, the injury.
Is this water slide right here? It's called the Cannonball Loop. It was built without the assistance or consultation of any engineers whatsoever. The owner of the park built it himself. When they sent down the initial crash test dummies, they came out the other side without heads, which was obviously a problem. And so they adjusted the angle and they made it safe enough so that you wouldn't die on it. But because so many riders were reporting severe neurological effects after going down this water slide, the owner was eventually forced to bring in a Navy physician who inspected it and then concluded, and I want to get this right, that at that moment in time in American history, there were two places where a civilian could experience the forces of 9 Gs on the human body. One was in the backseat of an F-15 fighter jet, and the other was this water slide. Okay, but it gets better, not really better at all. There were also things like this. So in 1984, around the same time that this was happening at Class Action Park, people died in multiple haunted castles and amusement parks throughout the United States because they were complete fire traps that were prone to bursting into flame. Unless you think that I'm picking on the 1970s and 80s, this had actually been an improvement over what it had been in the past. This was Coney Island before. And so what we have here was a long history of amusement parks being incredibly dangerous in the United States. What made the 1970s and 80s different was that after these very high-profile accidents were widely publicized throughout the United States, the amusement park industry realized that injuries really at any park were bad for all parks, right? It turns out that for consumers, roller coasters are fungible. And so having Class Action Park was a threat to the bottom line for amusement parks all throughout the country. And so what did the industry decide to do? Well, they decided to band together into various trade groups and associations, most notably the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions, the IAAPA. And those groups then partnered with the American Society for Testing and Materials to develop very extensive industry standards for amusement park rides. This ultimately led to the release of what's called ASTM F24, which is still the it's not binding, but the lead guidance on amusement park safety in the United States. And these standards covered virtually all aspects of safety for all rides, ranging from literally hay rides to the most sophisticated roller coasters on the market. And the great news is that this industry self-regulation approach has worked incredibly, incredibly well. So as a result, you're actually more likely now to be killed by lightning in the parking lot of an amusement park in the United States than you are to be killed on an amusement park ride. And this is a remarkable achievement if you think about, number one, how many people ride amusement park rides every year, and the diversity of humans that ride amusement park rides. We have very young people, we have very old people, we have people with numerous health conditions, we have pregnant people, all of whom ride rides with great success every year in the United States. And this was achieved with virtually no involvement from state or federal government. It was really nearly entirely industry driven. So what can this case study tell us about self-regulation in the autonomous vehicle industry? Well, I think that AV manufacturers today are in a posture that's similar-ish to the one that amusement parks were in back in the 1970s and 80s. I think the overwhelming majority of them are acting in good faith to develop vehicles that are significantly safer than human-driven vehicles on the market now, and that's all good news. There still remains, however, significant consumer skepticism about autonomous vehicles. People think that roller coasters are fun. People think that autonomous vehicles are dangerous, at least according to recent polling. And the industry has a long way to go in convincing Americans that these vehicles are not only safe, but they actually should buy them or use them more regularly than they already are. And these hurdles become significantly more difficult every time something like this happens, right? or this, both of these Joel referenced in his talk, or this, right? It doesn't matter what kind of car it is. It doesn't matter if it's a Tesla with autopilot, or a BMW with driver assist, or a GM with Super Cruise. When people see any AV involved in an accident, it makes them question the safety of all AVs, not just those of a particular manufacturer. So like the amusement park industry, the entire autonomous vehicle industry has a strong economic interest in ensuring that all autonomous vehicles are as safe as possible. It's in Waymo's interest for GM's cars to be safe. It's in Tesla's interest for BMW's cars to be safe. And I think that creates exactly the kind of scenario that might make self-regulation a meaningful possibility in the autonomous vehicle world. I do, however, want to acknowledge a number of limitations in this case of study. First and foremost, for this approach to work, there has to be a single industry, and I think that there are good reasons to suggest that there isn't in the AV world. There's really two major approaches. Some companies like Waymo have chosen not to release any cars to the market until they are fully autonomous. Other companies like Tesla are gradually introducing greater amounts of autonomy into their cars over time. These are two entirely different market bets, and so I think there's reason to think that there isn't sort of a unified industry, perhaps in the way that there should be for this model to work. Secondly, obviously, the intellectual property interests in the autonomous vehicle industry are almost certainly more powerful than they are in the amusement park industry. Rides are still built pretty ad hoc. There's not a lot of intellectual property comparatively in the amusement park industry. So it may be the case that the protective instincts of industry players are simply more powerful than the desire to make the industry as safe as possible. And I think that remains to be seen. And then finally, I think the most obvious objection to this case study is that autonomous vehicles are not rides. They are significantly more dangerous, potentially. They're not on a track, right? They do significantly more complex things than roller coasters do. And I think that's a limitation as well. So given those limitations, I set out to see if I could find another industry in which the risk is more unmanageable, but where the industry actually manages it all the same. And that leads to the American motion picture industry. Now you really think that I've lost my mind. So hear me out here. The problem with autonomous vehicles is this, and Joel said this in his presentation. They are never going to be 100% safe. No matter how hard the industry works, there will always be an accident and fatality rate given the complexity of driving on public roads. And hopefully, I believe this to be true, that eventual fatality and accident rate will be significantly lower than it has been historically for human-driven cars, but there will be an accident rate nonetheless. I don't see how that's avoidable. And if it's not, and even if the safety record is very, very good, consumer confidence is still going to be a problem for this industry. So how do we go about convincing people that these vehicles are better and safer than driving their own cars? And here I think the history of the movie industry in this country is actually fairly instructive. So if you think for a moment, going to a theater to watch a film involves risk. And it's easy to forget that in 2025, in which you can gather an immense amount of information, including maybe the movie itself from YouTube, before you go see the actual movie in a theater. But think about what it was like in, say, 1955, or imagine what it would be like if you had no information available to you about a movie that you were selecting at a movie theater. You show up with your kids, the only information that you have available is the title of the film. If that were the case and you were standing with your 5-year-old, you might choose a film like The Silence of the Lambs, which sounds like a really lovely, innocuous nature pick. And then 10 minutes into the film, you would be faced with this, right? Which is very non-ideal if you are a parent. Unless you think that this problem is not particularly serious, studies have consistently shown now that exposure to scary movies can cause long-term anxiety and even PTSD, even in college students, actually. And that exposure to violence can simultaneously be harmful to children, with studies suggesting that it can lead to behavioral changes like decreased empathy and increased aggressive behavior. So the risk from movies is not illusory, and consumers are right to be cautious before sitting down to watch a movie, particularly if children or their parents are involved, right? The risks are real. On the other hand, we would surely be worse off as film goers and as a society if the film industry catered exclusively to the most sensitive viewers, leaving us without important films like Schindler's List or Dead Man Walking or Brokeback Mountain or 12 Years a Slave, right? We cannot mitigate the risk of films down to zero without eliminating some of the most important and meaningful films that we have and the cultural presence that they represent. So what to do? Well, for about 50 years, we experimented with local censorship boards, and that went about as well as you would expect. Film studios hated it because these boards varied widely in what they thought was appropriate. So, Pennsylvania, for example, wouldn't allow plot lines involving pregnancy. Chicago didn't like films with dancing, so on and so forth. So, by 1968, the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, had it and decided to take matters into its own hands and self-regulate, with the goal of striking a balance between sensitive and vulnerable viewers and protecting artistic expression. And what resulted worked so incredibly well that we really don't think about it anymore. They created the standardized rating system that we all understand, know, and maybe even love. So now when you're choosing a movie for your kids, it's relatively easy to do so just by looking at the standardized ratings that we have available, right? They clearly signal to you which films are going to be appropriate and which will not. And what's remarkable about the system is how little criticism it gets in modern times. These are widely accepted, they're trusted in this country. We have not seen really recently any blowback from consumers. What's so brilliant about movie ratings, in my mind, is that they don't eliminate the risk at issue, they just create transparency around it, right? And by and large, that's been enough for the general public. We now accept that there are movies with content that we may not personally want to witness, and the solution to that is not to go to those movies. And as long as we are warned in advance that a movie contains that content, and we're by and large willing to allow those movies to be screened in our communities. So, what can this teach us about autonomous vehicles? I think that the members of the general public now are a little bit like moviegoers in the pre-ratings era, and that they have very little ability to assess the risk when they see an autonomous vehicle driving down the road. So, for example, if you go to Phoenix right now, Waymo is running a pilot program. You can summon a Waymo just like you would an Uber. I recommend doing it, it's pretty awesome. But as you stand there contemplating your options on the street corner between selecting an Uber with a human driver or a Waymo without a driver at all, you really have very little ability to assess which one's safer unless you're somebody who writes about autonomous vehicles for a living. It's a giant question mark on the side of the vehicle. And what polling shows us is that when people are uncertain about the risk of a new technology, they tend to assume the worst. They're going to assume that the Waymo is significantly more dangerous than the Uber. In the case of AVs, that means they're not going to use them and they're not going to buy them. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can increase risk transparency for AVs. And I don't have a long time to go through all of the possible options that I explore in my paper. So let me give you just a visual one here that's a little bit silly, but I think actually accomplishes a lot. So Waymo, if you've seen one driving on the street, has a screen at the top. And if you summon a Waymo, it actually has your name on it when it comes to pick you up so that you know that it's your Waymo rather than somebody else. What if instead of having a Waymo logo or the name of the person that it's picking up, it had something like this, a number or percentage on the top indicating how much safer or less safer we would expect riding in that car to be than riding in an Uber with a human driver. More consumers might be more willing to summon Waymos more often if they knew that they were 87% safer or 87% less likely to result in injury and death than summoning an Uber with a human driver. What the movie industry case study teaches us is that when a risk can't be mitigated down to zero or something close to it, transparency and clear communication can actually be enough to promote consumer confidence. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all emerging tech with respect to what it's communicating and what it's not communicating to the general public. Now, of course, these case studies and these approaches are not mutually exclusive. My recommendation would be to combine some combination of risk mitigation and risk transparency. There is a strong economic interest for for the industry to do it, and I think there are moral reasons to do so as well. I think these case studies, though, also highlight a point that often gets lost when we talk about emerging technology and self-regulation. And that's that the risk of failed or non-existent regulation from the federal government runs not just to consumers and to citizens, but to industries as well, right? Autonomous vehicle companies have been asking the federal government for more regulation for years. They want to save up the possibility of 50 state standards that they're going to have to comply with, and they want to have some sort of centralized database of regulation that's significantly easier from a compliance perspective. But instead of waiting for that to come, and I don't think that it ever will come, the industry itself should be incentivized to band together and to think about other opportunities for governance that are good not only for them but for consumers, because I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. So in conclusion here, is an autonomous vehicle a roller coaster or a Hollywood film? It's both, and it's likely more. And as somebody who believes in the future of this technology and who thinks that AVs are going to represent a really beneficial transportation shift for the general public, I hope we continue to very seriously assess our alternatives to government oversight that almost certainly will not come. Thank you.
I think your analogies are spot on and wonderful. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the moderator here to ask. I do think those are wonderful examples and analogies here. But the examples of self-regulation appear to me to work because the person accepting risk, right, is the one making that economic risk. Okay, I'm willing to take the chance that this may scar me forever by watching, Silence of the Lambs, or with Action Park, I can show you the kind of abrasion injury I still have left from an accident there when I was 12. Not the safest place, but with autonomous vehicles, we're talking about circumstances in which my tolerance for risk is going to necessarily increase the risks to others, right? So maybe I don't care if I kill people in my neighborhood, but my neighbors care. And how does self-regulation under these circumstances or transparency really can it address that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like I said, an autonomous vehicle is not a roller coaster, and it does present. Even if you feel comfortable with the risk, you're certainly potentially creating risk for drivers on the road around you. I think the data suggests that actually autonomous vehicles make roads safer, generally speaking. But to the extent that we had data suggesting that wasn't true, and there may be an in-between time where we have fully, self-driving cars on the roads, in addition to, semi autonomous driver-assisted cars, and then just sort of traditional human-driven cars. There may become a time where actually that is significantly more unsafe. And there I think that my case studies break down a little bit, right? Because it shouldn't just be the consumer making the decision. There has to be a choice coming from the general public at large. But again, I would say that even in that situation, the industry has a strong economic interest in controlling for that problem to preserve their market share.
Although it did take the automobile industry legislation and a great deal of persuasion to mandate seatbelts and airbags.
Yeah.
Even though it was one of potentially at the time a very smart decision to make those issues of choice and customer preference on how much they want to upgrade their cars.
Yeah.
It then became clear that it was better for everyone, even if we didn't allow that economic choice to really happen.
The other interesting thing, I wrote a paper about this. I wrote a paper about the transition from cars to vehicles around 1912. And it's interesting because as Joel points out, right, there's this kind of initial outcry against vehicles. People literally lined the streets of New York City one summer and threw stones at passing cars because they thought they were so dangerous. There was a great op-ed at the time that said that nobody had contemplated the effects of going at the blazingly fast speed of 12 miles per hour on the uterus, right? And that we were really jeopardizing human fertility. But what happened was not so much that regulation stepped in and solved that problem for us. It's that people realized that cars were cool and that cars got them to work faster. And so they just adopted cars in large measures when their neighbors went out and did that. So that was a case where we didn't even need industry self-regulation. Culturally, there was a shift in America that led to the changes that we needed.
So I think you've convinced me that autonomous vehicles are both roller coasters and Hollywood films. What if they're also lunch meat? Like I'm a big law and norms person, and one of the things we've seen is that when you take regulations away from some things, they get awful. Because for self-regulation to work, you need some sort of consistent belief among those who are being regulated that regulation is good. Um, and you know, the uh, when the federal government said, you know what, lunch meat makers, you regulate yourself. What happened was a lot of really sick people. And while it's true that there is an incentive to, you know, Hillshire Farms for Boar's Head to be safe, that didn't seem to matter. So how do we distinguish self-regulation and norms-based compliance in the roller coaster industry from the sort of failure of that in the lunch meat industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think my answer is this. Autonomous vehicles are sexier than lunch meat, right? Which is that, yeah, we have an E. coli outbreak, it feels like every 3 months now, right? And there's kind of an initial splash and then nobody talks about it. But we still talk about the self-driving accident in Tempe, Arizona, right? They are incredibly high profile when they happen. Now that will change over time, right? As autonomy becomes more ubiquitous on US roads, I think each new AV accident is going to get less sustained attention than it does now. And I think at that point, the concern is valid, which is that at that point, maybe the self-regulation isn't as appealing to members of the industry. But I think right now, it's devastating for all players in the market whenever one of these articles pops up, because they just never die, right? We're still talking about them years later.
So I'm sorry for using Waymo in my own presentation and bringing too much attention to a very particular issue, and my fear of being stuck in a car that I can't get out of, that's going in circles and circles, and why I will never get in one. But my question, I think, follows from this one. When I think of for someone who works in financial regulation and in lawyer regulation, I think of self-regulation, I think a little bit differently than you're using it. So I'm wondering your thoughts about this. In our areas, in financial regulation, attorney regulation, we are self-regulated, but the self-regulation is always answerable to someone. And as I hear you describing the regulation well, maybe, okay, we can disagree about whether it's effective. That's another story. But there's somebody that's in charge and delegates that ability. So when I hear you talk about self-regulation of movies and roller coasters, I'm thinking about, is this really self-regulation or is it voluntary regulation? And if it's voluntary regulation because there's no one in charge of making sure that those who self-regulate do in fact do so, do we also have a bit of a free rider problem for those who don't opt into the regulation itself, or is reputational risk sufficient to force everybody to the optimal level of regulation?
Yeah, I mean that is the $20 million question in the area of self-regulation and soft law. Well, I will use it. I will go back to the amusement park case study and saying that, you know, soft law has a way of becoming hard law. So we have the ASTM standards, right? We have the sort of central body that self-regulates the industry. But what's interesting now is you can't get insurance if you don't have an accreditation from that body, right? So that's not hard law, but you're not going to be able to operate your little amusement park or your big amusement park if you don't have the certifications you need from this self-regulating industry. So that's one of the things that I'm really heartened by. I didn't set out to be a self-regulation proponent, right? Like that's really kind of anathema to me for a long time. But the more I study this area, the more I see that it really does begin not to mimic, but to act in almost identical ways to hard law in ways that are really great. And so I would be hopeful that something like this would happen, right? That, you know, we don't have a meaningful and robust body of regulations from the federal government on AVs. I'm pessimistic that those will ever come. But we do actually have industry standards that begin to have, you know, force by way of the insurance industry and by way of other, you know, levers of control in society that are still very, very important.
Actually, if I can ask Joel a question that I think flows from much of this. In your presentation, I was very much struck when you were highlighting the fact that some of the most regulated of our automated systems are in fact ones that operate in some respects on the simplest kind of model, right? We're often trains going from one place to another on tracks, or even planes flying in the sky with very few other obstacles on predetermined paths, but yet they are subject to some of the most significant oversight and regulation. And in part because as your description was that they carry more of us at any given time, or I would assume in other circumstances, also create the largest risk of injury in any given incident. Right? But how do you feel about the fact that in many respects, and along the lines of advocating for a model of potential self-regulation here, autonomous vehicles are an example in which we're having the least amount of regulation, and perhaps because we think it's okay, because the risk of any individual incident is much smaller, right? Kill 5 people, very different than poison an entire community. Or have a plane crash and then talk about finding bodies for days. Given the history of the regulations that you've seen and the evolution as part of your practice, do you think this is an issue that will in fact cause pause under these circumstances?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we also represent a lot of clients in the aviation industry, and we have these conversations, these exact conversations, quite a bit. That when you have the DCA crash, the Washington National Airport crash that happened earlier this year, many people, my family members, said, "Hey, is it safe to get on an airplane ever again? Because what if this happens to me?" And that was a horrific loss of life, about 70 people. But when we think about that, the number of people that die on our roadways every day is much more than that across our entire country, and nobody blinks an eye, right? It is local news. There was a crash, single car, double car, pile up, and this many people died, and it's like, oh, interesting. And we all generally go on with our lives unless we were personally impacted by that crash. But it is a social norms question for us that we all feel that we need that access to the automobile, whether it be our personal car ownership or the ability to ride in another's car, whether it be a taxi or an Uber or Lyft, to get to where we need to go, such that we're willing to accept the risk at a greater risk of getting in that car than we would be willing to accept getting into that aircraft if aircraft were falling out of the sky or crashing into each other on a regular basis. And for the federal regulator, there also is that challenge, which is purely is the cost of regulation worth the reward that we get out of the back end? And I do feel like as a country, we are getting more conscious of this, especially having had some of the highest incidents or deaths in vehicle operation over the course of the last decade. When most other industries, the safety is they're continuing to become more safe. And in many respects, the operation of automobiles is at some of its most risky that it's ever been, with more distractions and more risky behavior, decisions to take risky behavior happening in the automobile. So the question is a good one insofar as, will that change our social norms, which would then drive change in the legal and regulatory environment? Here in Washington, what we will often say is that Congress is really good at doing 2 things: doing nothing and overreacting. So when you think about the scenarios where we say on a daily basis there are hundreds of people dying in automobiles, and we have not seen a moment where we feel like the legislation or regulations need to change, and then a moment when there is a massive accident of an autonomous bus or autonomous cars crashing into each other or malfunctioning, then that could be the scenario where more regulation comes in. But my impression is that we will continue to have personal car or small lightweight passenger vehicles operated or regulated at a lower level than, you know, common carriers, even when it comes to those autonomous vehicles or level 4, level 5 self-driving vehicles.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
And this gets to the idea of liberty with some drivers. Many people have read the newspaper and found out that, Grandma Brubaker, hit the gas pedal a little bit too hard and invited herself into the local diner. And some people didn't finish their breakfast or got hurt. So should that person then, let's say they're above this statutory vigilance age of 75, be forced if they're ever gonna drive again to be in a fully autonomous vehicle because it would be safer?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting questions to contemplate is if at a certain point the insurance industry basically requires us to give up our cars, right? Like, I don't think we will ever. I hate to say it. I can't imagine the government anytime the next few decades saying, look, nobody gets to drive their own cars anymore, right? What I think may become a possibility, or what may happen, is that eventually level 5 cars are available to consumers. They are so much safer than human driven cars that you can no longer get driver's insurance, or it becomes so prohibitively expensive that people are forced financially to adopt EVs sooner than they might otherwise choose to do so. I'm interested in whether that happens during my lifetime. I was hoping it would happen before my teenage kids learn to drive, but I don't think we're gonna quite hit that. Again, my daughter starts driving next year, but I think that that's the more likely possibility, is that it just becomes prohibitively expensive to insure it.
Questions?
So on your proposal or for the solution of when you were it would provide like a movie type rating, where do you think that data would be pulled from, and how? I had another part to that question, but I guess start with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that has to come from some sort of self-governance body. I would not trust, for example, Tesla right now to provide us with data that is super accurate with respect to its safety. But the federal government does still do a very good job in, safety testing. I'm hoping it will get better for autonomous vehicles. We're not there yet, but that might be a place where the federal government can serve a role, where it can continue to test and to provide data. But yeah, it would have to come from somebody other than me.
Okay, and thank you. And would that be in comparison to just like self-driven cars by humans, or would that be also in comparison to maybe other public transportation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Like I said, we're gonna soon be, I mean, we already are in some cities in a state where we have, purely human driven, so level 1, level 2 cars. We have level 3 cars on the road. When I drive to school in the morning, I'm not usually driving to school. My car is driving itself and I'm supervising, and then you have a Waymo that doesn't have a human in the loop at all. And so then the question is, as compared to what? And the thing about the movie ratings is that they're very easy to understand. They're pithy, they're short, right? When we're talking about comparative safety data, I think how we communicate that becomes just a thorn in your mouth.
Thank you.
Oh, we have time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you. I have another liberty-related question. So I think some of the distinction between, say, the airplane crash at DCA, self-driving cars, say level 4, level 5, and then regular cars, is the issue of liberty, randomness, and arbitrary behavior, which is as a passenger of that plane or as a passenger of a self-driving car, you have no control. It seems to be completely arbitrary. There's nothing you can do to have prevented a crash, and I think that scares people. With just a regular car, you can be an excellent driver. So perhaps we are making blanket assumptions about drivers. We're aggregating data, and that's fair. But one could be an excellent driver who always drives the speed limit, never texts, never drives drunk. So what do we do about that issue? But perhaps that's difficult to enforce at scale, right? And we say, well, on average, this is what drivers do, and it's best if everyone just drives just all cars are autonomous. Also, we have to think about the rollout. It's not going to be one day where all cars become autonomous. I think it's also something to think about. So some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. like I said, I think the insurance industry is going to take care of that for us eventually. But I would also push back a little bit. I think even the safest driver, right, has limited powers of
Oh, sure.
perception. I mean, you can always drive the speed limit and signal 75 feet before your turn, and there can be an animal that jumps out, and you're not going to respond as quickly as an AV. I don't know, Joel. Do you have a sense of that question?
We get it a lot. I mean, in some parts of the country right now, I think level 4 self-driving vehicles, considering that they're going to be in a ride hailing type model, because each individual vehicle, if you consider how many billions of dollars that the leading self-driving vehicle companies have poured into their vehicles, that is baked in that intellectual property and safe sensor suite with redundant computing systems. That's going to put those vehicles outside of the grasp of the 0.0001% of Americans that could actually purchase those vehicles if they were ever made available for sale. That means that most of these companies are going to focus their deployments in the highly densely populated areas where those vehicles are going to be used at a significant basis, right? That they're going to have riders hopping in and hopping out of those vehicles so they can maximize the revenue per vehicle mile traveled. And that creates real challenges when we think about what the future looks like in the United States, where there's going to be potentially pockets of the country that don't see fully self-driving cars for 30, 40, 50 years, and other parts of the country that only have self-driving vehicles or have a significant portion of the fleet be self-driving vehicles. And it's going to be very inconsistent for a period of time as the technology continues to mature. Now, it could be a point in time that just like, we all have blind spot indicators, or not all, but many cars have blind spot indicators. And your cruise control can be adaptive cruise control and those types of features. Like those will continue to be added to self-driving vehicles to make them kind of the bottom up approach become more automated. And then there will be the top down approach, which will be fully automated. And at some point they will meet in the future. But we will live in a world where there will be a combination of self-driving vehicles and human-driven vehicles for the foreseeable future. And that means that there will be complicated fact patterns for how those vehicles interact, whether they be self-regulated or heavily regulated from the federal government.
Thank you very much. So let me exercise my prerogative again as moderator to be the first to thank you both for your excellent presentations, and then get the last word in, which is in response to your freedom question. I think the odds of legislatures punishing people for continuing to drive non-autonomous vehicles is about as likely as the legislature prohibiting football. Thank you, everyone.